Is watch really a good investment? Whenever we talk about investing, probably we talk about stocks, bonds, ETFs, mutual funds. Probably others may think about private equity, real estate, cryptocurrency. Do people really invest in watches? And if yes, what factors really determine the value of a watch? And for beginners who are interested in investing in watches, what are the pitfalls that you need to be aware of? And today I'm so happy to have Stephan Kolz to join the conversation. Stephan Kolz is the founder and CEO of Your Assets. He brings over a decade of wealth management experience across Asia and Europe. And before establishing Your Assets, he served as the head of investment management and chief operating officer of Vontobel in Asia. He's currently based in Zurich, Switzerland. And Stefan, also an old friend of mine back then when both of us were in Hong Kong covering the private banking industry. He's also a CFA charter holder. Hello, Stefan. Welcome.
Hello, Charlene. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast to talk about this very fascinating topic, obviously, for me and hopefully for everyone listening as well.
Yeah, exactly. I know I'm aware actually your passion for watches. And today we're actually shifting gears a little bit. We're not discussing the perfect watches to complement your suits for your next client meeting or upscale events. Instead, today we're diving into the world of watches as an investment. So my opening question is this intriguing subject. Are watches a good investment? And what exactly positions them as promising investment opportunities, Stefan?
Good. Well, it's a good question. Obviously, I think they are. This is the reason why I founded your asset, the company.
Mhm.
But it always depends. There are so many luxury watches. Not all of them would qualify as an investment. And as we
Yeah.
say with our company, it's about combining the rational with the emotional. So there is an investment component to it. However, there's also the emotionality to a timepiece to it.
Mm.
So it depends, and we're going to dive deeper into that.
Yeah, and then like previously, when we talk about watches, and then it's not like over the past few years, it suddenly become an investment option for high net worth individual or for even retail investors, right? I think it has a really long history, right? And how has watch collecting evolved as an investment option over, the past years, let's say, or even decades?
It's very interesting because you mentioned cryptocurrencies before, and cryptocurrencies
Yeah.
have really been around only since, let's say, 2009,
Really new, right?
2010.
Exactly. Hmm.
It's very new. So we're just talking about a bit of over a decade. Whereas if you look at luxury watches and the brands like Patek Philippe, Rolex, the ones that everyone will immediately know, they're
Mm-hmm.
centuries old. So we're not talking about decades, we're talking about centuries. They're founded in the
Yes.
1800 and something. The oldest watch brand dates back all the way to 1700 and something, which is Breguet. So there is
Mm-hmm.
this huge heritage to watches. And there's always been that
Mm.
fascination by people towards this mechanisms. And that's why they have evolved over time, with Rolex and those
Mm-hmm.
other brands always pioneering some certain subjects within the watch world. So it's been, I don't know, I can only go as far back as for my own, lifespan, but there obviously
Mm-hmm.
were watch collectors before me. I think what's really interesting, it's not just looking at are there watch collectors, but like how did they buy and sell? And I think that has
Mm.
developed a lot over time, and especially over the last 10 years, a lot. Because it used to, I guess, mostly be via auctions. So you can purchase a watch from the retailer and then you would sell
Mm-hmm.
it if you wanted to sell it. I mean, of course, you can always find a friend to sell it to, but you would
Yeah.
have sold it probably via auctions. And then with the establishment of marketplaces, especially digital marketplaces, so suddenly you add transparency to that market. So it's becoming suddenly a discovery. It's easier for people to list their watches for sale. Suddenly there's a price to it. There can be negotiations. And that is something which has obviously super fueled the interest, I think, in watches over the past decade, especially with, the online platforms and social media.
That's so good. You talk about transparency. I think at later stage we will go deeper into it since we discussed that's one of the key trends that we currently see in the watch investment markets, right? Like transparency, the price transparency, and all this kind of thing. And it's so interesting you mentioned Rolex. Why I found it so interesting is about just like last year, both you and me, we are here based in Zurich, Switzerland. I went to Bahnhofstrasse, I think 1 year ago, this time last year. And then I went to Rolex store. I wanted to sign my name up for just for a really basic one. And I mean, I haven't even heard back from them. It's been like a year since I signed my, you cannot just like,
Yeah.
just to share with our audience, even if you have money, like for you have 10K or 5K, whatever you want to have a basic, Rolex. What's the name of the basic? It's called.
I think the most basic, beautiful one is
Is
an Oyster Perpetual
Yeah, yeah.
or
I think that's
Datejust.
the one. Yeah, probably. I'm not. I'm not really an expert in that, but what they, you cannot just buy it immediately, right, at a
Yeah,
Rolex store, and
yeah.
especially for those really popular ones. And then I've been waiting for like over a year, so I'm still on their wait list. So my next question to you, Stefan, is yeah, since you mentioned the mechanism, all those kind of things. So what makes watches, expensive, for example? Is it really about their design mechanism or about the hours those watchmakers spend in order to to make the
Yeah,
watch?
yeah. I mean, a good question. Us as being rational investors, I would be looking at it from two sides. There is an intrinsic value to it,
Mm-hmm.
but when we just only look at the intrinsic value, that would be the hours of craftsmanship, how much time it took to design and develop. This is something which you can measure, and the materials that go into it as well. But then, of course, there
Mm-hmm.
is luxury to it as well. So, and there's actually also iconic status that has grown over time. And I'm not
Mm-hmm.
meaning that people are suddenly more into watches. I'm talking about models. This the first watch from Rolex, for example, that was really waterproof. A submariner that was invented in 1953. So suddenly you get that iconic status to it as well. So it's both.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's the craftsmanship, no doubt, that goes into it, because you cannot just multiply easily a watch. It's a decade old, like we said, centuries old industry,
Mm,
situated in Switzerland. That's why you have most of the luxury watches actually coming out of Switzerland. And it's not
exactly.
that
Yeah.
easy, and it's not that easy to copy it elsewhere. So that's why they really go such a lot of attention to detail into each watch. And I was fortunate enough I could visit some of the manufacturers and really see, like the different station a watch goes through when it already comes to manufacturing. Of course, we didn't see all the pre-planning that goes into a watch, but it's very, very fascinating. I can only recommend people to, go
It's
online
so
and look at
different.
some manufacturer visits. Beautiful.
Yeah. It's good that you mentioned, it's really about the both sides, right? And then, when you see a watch, like it can cost 5,000, it can also cost 50,000 or exactly, for those kind of, maybe just out of curiosity, what makes the huge difference between two luxury watches? Do you
Yeah, I
think it's
think
mainly
that it's
because the
also
intrinsic?
economies of scale.
Hmm.
I would say it's both. It's one, it's obviously pricing power of a brand, but then a brand is always also very careful in how they are pricing their products, where in the market they want to be
Hmm.
perceived. But then buyers of the watches, they are also very looking closely at what do they get from it, like how old is the brand, how much of raffinesse is going into actually the production of a watch. So I
Mm.
think what makes an expensive watch really expensive is obviously the amount of craftsmanship that goes into it. But as I said, economies of scale, that means how many how many units do I produce of a watch? Of course, if I have my machinery, which and I'm able to produce thousands of pieces, still beautiful
Hmm.
watches. But then if I add like manual work to it, to the dial, to the movement, etc., then I'll only produce a couple of hundred watches. So suddenly the entire cost of development of a watch and then only going into
Yeah,
100
goes up.
pieces is obviously
Hmm.
price will go up. And then it's about the complications, of course, as well. You can have a simple like a minute an hour watch. Then you can add complications to it, like chronograph or an annual calendar, and then it becomes very
Mm.
fancy when you go into tourbillons or even minute repeaters. They're the funny ones when they acoustically signal the time for you.
Mm-mm. And one thing, I mean, I hate really generalized things, but just like if we really have to generalize, for example, now you see a watch that costs maybe 100K, and how much do you attribute to the intrinsic value? For example, the diamond that it uses, right, and the hours that it spent, and how much you will attribute to design, the history, the things that behind it, or it's really
Mm.
hard to say.
I think it's hard to say. I haven't worked in the watchmaking industry, so I couldn't say it. Probably if I did, then I wouldn't say it. But I do think it's probably, if I would have a guess, I would
Mm,
think it's around 20%. Around 20%, I think, would really be the intrinsic value. But that is so unfair to
mm,
say, because you know that you will need to ship it. There's
yeah, yeah.
obviously the pure production price. The brand needs to sell it. They need to sell it to their retail network, or they have direct to consumer distribution channels. So a lot of this, and then there is marketing, etc. So only looking at what it costs to produce the watch would obviously grossly underestimating the effort of producing and selling a watch.
Okay, maybe roughly 20-30%. I mean, we don't know. It's just like out of curiosity. I thought, oh, it's good to know this. And Stefan, you already mentioned some names, for example, or some brands. Also, so like you mentioned at the very beginning, it's not every brand or every watch is worth investing, right? And if again, if we want to generalize a little bit, are there any popular brands or watches that a lot of people are pursuing because they have better investment value than the other brands or watches?
I think it also depends on where your journey starts. Obviously, if you are coming into watch collecting, you would naturally start. You would know about an Omega. You would know
Oh
about
my,
a Rolex, of course. Because also
yeah.
those are the ones who do a lot of marketing. So of course you would have come across them. You would even know Longines, etc. Other of those beautiful brands. But
Mm.
I'd say it's probably, if you are looking into investing in watches,
Mhm.
like I wouldn't advise that, because there's always this um, uh, the passionate aspect to a watch and the emotionality. But if it's like purely from
Mm.
an investment perspective, I think that really could start from a watch price at 10,000 and above.
Mhm.
And it will probably be from the brands that have been around for centuries, have always been very desired. And again, it very much depends on the liquidity in the market. You can have a really beautiful watch that has a high intrinsic value, but if you do not have a buyer for it, you will not get a
Yeah.
good price,
Mm.
right?
Yeah,
So,
it's
and then the
like
highest
car as
liquidity,
well, right? The secondary market, how liquid it is, right? It's
uh,
not only about
absolutely.
the exactly. Mm.
I mean, I think this is where we can draw a bit of a parallel to cryptocurrencies, and because that development has gone so fast. I
Mm.
remember, me still being the private banker, some of my customers approached me in 2011, 2012, talking about Bitcoin, and I was like, okay, Bitcoin, I've
Mhm.
heard about it, but at that time it was so hard to even purchase a Bitcoin, and if you have one, it's like, how are you going to sell it? Like, where do you store it? You just didn't know. Really need to put a
Mm.
lot of effort in figuring out how you can trade it. So that has developed tremendously. I do think, and that's where we stand in the watch market already today, and the development going forward, it's going to be a lot more liquidity, or let's say trading venues for watches as well. So I do think there will be other brands entering that higher liquidity status. So actually the investment universe becomes
Mm.
broader.
Yeah, and you just mentioned a few brands. Yeah, again, out of curiosity, I see some other brands, like for example, luxury brands, like even Cartier, or
Mm,
even Gucci, those kind of,
yeah, yeah.
those brands who used to sell handbags and then they started to make watches as well. What's
Mm.
your opinion on it?
I think it's beautiful. You look at LVMH as a
Yeah.
really good example. So you have three large groups, and then there are independent brands. The largest watch group would be Richemont. Then it's probably
Mm-hmm.
Swatch and LVMH group. And LVMH group, as we all know, Mr. Arnault, he has 5 children, and now 2 of his children are dedicated to actually the watch segment within the LVMH group. So I think it's
Mm-hmm.
also showing clearly that this largest luxury group in Europe and in the world is showing a clear interest in developing the watch, their own watch maisons or métiers. So Louis Vuitton, you could see that, as you say, mostly known for their leather goods wear and their other apparel, luxury, obviously. Now they go into like high timepieces. Same for Hermes. Very interesting. Now suddenly they
Yeah,
sell a lot of
exactly.
watches as well. Beautiful creations.
Yeah.
So I think it's very interesting regarding the investment aspect because they're so new. Although they probably took over, more heritage watchmaking, not brands, but the manufacturer movement producers, for example.
Mm-hmm.
They're obviously not that established. So if you talk about the watches, you would naturally think about Patek and Rolex, Jaeger
Exactly.
LeCoultre,
Yeah.
many of those brands, Omega, as I mentioned before,
Mm-hmm.
quicker than you would suddenly think about Gucci as a luxury watch producer or Chanel,
Yeah, exactly.
producing
And
beautiful watches too.
exactly. And based on your experience working with your clients, before, as a banker and now, as the founder of your assets, do people, invest in, like, for example, Hermes or Louis Vuitton watches, like, I mean, for investment purpose, or they are
Yeah.
mainly buying them for just for fashion, for looking good?
Yeah. I think you should definitely buy a watch because you like it and you look good and it gives you
Mm-hmm,
that pleasure. So I think that's important. Um, I don't think that's the main motivation for purchasing a Chanel watch. I cannot believe that. I also
Can you say
think in
again? I
general,
think you were cut off a little bit, Stefan. Just
I don't
can you repeat
think
that?
from those brands as Hermes
Mm-hmm.
and Chanel, I don't think buyers of their watches mainly have an investment aspect as their
Purpose.
first
Yeah. Okay.
priority when choosing
Mm-hmm.
that brand. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, exactly. If you really want to, like you mentioned, there is liquidity risk, there's here and that, different kind of risk attached to it. If you really want to buy it just purely for investment, maybe it's just not worth it. And talking about risks, and you mentioned liquidity risks, right? And then just like for especially those investor, beginners, when for example, when I really want to invest in watch, what are the risks associated with watch investments usually? You just
Mm,
mentioned liquidity. That's
mm,
great. Are
mm.
there any other major risks that we need to be aware of?
I think the major risk or a major obstacle would naturally be the ticket size. When you
Mm,
want, like, when someone is interested in involving themselves into investments and they buy ETFs, but you can invest in ETFs, let's say, with only 100 Swiss franc per month. So I
mm,
think it's the ticket size. I spoke about it before, and I said I think an investment watch could probably start
mm,
around 10,000, maybe a little bit lower. Even if it was
10,000.
5,000, that's already quite a ticket size. So, and
Mm,
that's
mm,
why, interestingly, the pure investment aspect, because when you buy a full watch compared to an ETF, I mean, the ETF, I cannot
mm,
put it on my wrist. I cannot bring my ETF to a nice bar. I cannot start a conversation over an
mm.
ETF. I mean, I could, but it's not visible. Whereas for the watch, it is. So it gives you
Yeah,
another pleasure. It gives you a dividend, another like an emotional dividend, right? So
yeah,
now,
yeah.
if you want to bring the ticket size down and solely look at the investment aspect, there are now platforms that haven't really existed, let's say, over 5 years ago, that
Mm-hmm.
allow fractional investments in watches as well. It's not what we do because we really believe in like people want to own the product, want to
Yeah.
wear the product and appreciate it. But there are opportunities that you say, you have that 100,000 Patek Philippe Nautilus special whatever watch,
Mm-hmm.
But then obviously you don't want to afford, not obviously, but in most instances, you don't want to afford the 100,000. So then you can buy fractions of it. So it's like other major risks, watch investment, of course, when it comes to the liquidity, And another other risk would be also wearing it, right? I think it's a risk nowadays
You can
if you
damage it,
wear.
you mean, right? Yeah.
Well, you can damage it, but you also
And
attract. You
lose
just
it.
need to
Yeah.
look at not that. It's even theft and robbery. Like, let's be frank.
Okay.
If you look in
Yeah.
the stories, and now just yesterday we saw it across the news. There was like one car going into one of those jewelry stores. I'm not saying the brand's name, but that happens. If it's a high ticket price item and actually it can be sold. If I'm stealing, let's say, a piece of furniture and that was expensive, but then it will be very hard for me to resell it. Right? So that's why for watches, I think theft and the loss and the damage, that's also a risk when you're investing. However,
Yeah. Yeah.
there are
Hmm.
good insurances for that. So there are actually
Yeah.
good insurances for this. They're not even that expensive. So it's probably advisable to take out an insurance if you purchase like a watch. And then I want to say
Yeah.
something else, because
Mhm.
when we talk about developing an asset class, you got to have liquidity for that. So liquidity, and that comes through a marketplace, because that's where people, buyers and sellers, are meeting. So there's actually a growth in marketplaces. They become more efficient. They are de-risking, like, my risk of perhaps purchasing a counterfeit product. So in order to make sure you don't, it's very important to buy from the right seller,
Mhm.
and to go through a trusted marketplace, which of course is your asset. Where we work with various verified retailers and
Mhm.
pre-owned merchants. They were the ones who sell the used watches, trade the used watches, and that gives the liquidity to the market. If then I'm looking again to compare it to real estate market or even the car market, another piece of liquidity is financing. The
Mhm.
ability to apply debt capital to that asset class, and this is something in our case which your asset stands for. So we allow someone looking to invest or just looking to purchase a nice luxury watch, and that costs 10,000, to also
Mhm.
pay that over whatever 24, 36, 48 months. So you break it down into monthly installments, which allows you to better align it with your monthly income.
Mhm.
So suddenly, the ticket size is not that high anymore, and you almost get into this like ETF style of accruing
Mm,
until you
mm.
eventually own the full product, but you get to wear it right away.
Yeah, that's really good to know. Let's come back to the topic of risks, Stefan. You mentioned the risk of, a watch being stolen, right? Liquidity risk, and you also you just mentioned, an insurance, for example, how to tackle all
Mm.
this kind of thing. And I was wondering, how about the price fluctuation? Like, for example, do you see any watches like previously people, oh, it's so popular, I want to have it, and then maybe after 1 year or 2 years, and then the price actually drop a lot? Do you see any
Mm.
major
Mm.
cases like that? Is this
I
something that?
mean, I think in order for that to happen, there's going to
Mhm.
be liquidity and transparency in the market. Because when we talk financial assets, and we talk about alternative investments, and it could be anything, right?
Mhm.
And they tend to have a less volatility. But one of the reasons why they have less volatility is because you don't see a price every day. Right? Real estate, for example, yeah, has less volatility
Yeah.
because you just don't trade your house every day. Whereas if you're looking into the crypto market, if you're looking in the stock market, I mean, that you see the changes every day, not every day,
Yeah,
but
the
every
mark to
second.
market price, what we
So
call it, right? But for these, we don't have
yeah,
a
and that
trading
naturally would.
platform. Yeah, very true.
Yeah, exactly. Not yet. Something I think with the fractional development is probably coming up as well.
Mm.
Um,
And
yeah,
back to my question, do you see any cases, major cases in the market like that? People cannot really sell it, and then maybe a buyer really they overprice it at the very beginning. Those buyers
I think it's
were
yeah, I
tricked.
think makes sense. Yeah, absolutely. So yes, there was. We just look at the past 5 years. So
Hmm.
and we look at one very iconic watch, a Rolex Daytona, and then there's a Patek
Hmm.
Philippe Nautilus, and there are many other models, especially sports steel models, which tended to not be that crazily expensive. And then I think it was because a lot of people saw it on social media. Suddenly there was a lot of presence on social media, also
Mm.
from celebrities, but it probably was already there before. And then you have a natural scarcity in terms of how many of those watches are being produced, available for sale. That's exactly what you said in the beginning. You go into a Rolex store, you want to purchase one of those watches, and you cannot. I mean, they have some of them in the window, but they're not selling it to you. So the reason for that is that there's more demand than there is supply, right? And if that is the case, it will drive up the price. And it cannot drive up the retail price because the retail price is set by the brand. But it can drive up the pre-owned market price. And that is what happened.
Yeah.
So there was let's say, over enthusiasm, because then it appreciated by double-digit percentages in the last 3 years. And that is, in general, I think it's a little bit unhealthy because it doesn't produce any income. So then you saw that for those watches, the Daytona and some of the others, super iconic, still very investable. But then they retraced from their irrationally high prices in between, and they came back down. Not entirely to where they were before, still trading higher, right? So I do think it actually presents a good opportunity if you're interested in watches. And 2 years or a year ago, people have said, like, oh, if only, I was fortunate enough that I could have purchased 5 years ago that watch. And I almost feel like, well, now is almost the time again. Like, if you wanted to buy one of those beautiful watches, you can buy them now. They're back available. They're cheaper in the secondary market. So the possibility is back.
Yeah, that's really actually an interesting story that you share. And if we, talk about the market overall, watch investment market, again, are there any, trends that you currently seeing, in the market? I remember you briefly mentioned, transparency and also financing. Would you be able to, talk a bit more about it?
Yeah, I think the financing, that was the reason, back when I was in Hong Kong, we got to know each other. I was working over 10 years for a bank. I knew very well about financing various asset classes. And then I have a couple of nice watches, so I'll show my watch. It's a Nautilus with a white dial. I have this for a long time now, close to 10 years. And then when I saw that the price appreciated more and more, and in the first place, it already cost a lot of money, so it was more expensive than 20,000 francs when I purchased it. So of course I was like paying a little bit of attention. It's like, what happens with that money that I spent, because I worked many hours for that. So, and then I thought, if it has that value, that asset-like characteristic, but it's tied up on my wrist. I love it, but it's tied up capital on my wrist, and I cannot sell a fraction of it. If I have whatever 50,000 worth of an ETF holding, I can sell off 10K because I need it and I want to deploy it somewhere else. If I have a watch worth 50,000, I cannot sell just 10,000 of it. So I could only sell the whole thing. But if I sell the whole thing, my emotional attachment is higher than to my ETFs, most likely. If I can sell some of my ETFs, I will not be emotionally damaged. If I had to sell that watch, that would actually be sad. But then it's tied up capital. So wouldn't it be so great if I could access that tied up capital and use it for something else, for another investment, or people have different good ideas of what they want to do with that capital. And that led me at that time to found the company Your Asset, because it does exactly that. So if you purchase a watch and it costs 20,000, so it's not really the question today, do I have to move that 20,000 from my savings and into a hard asset on my wrist, right? But it's much more, okay, I'm smoothing the purchase over 24 to 48 months, which allows me to align it with my monthly income. And most of us, we work get paid on a monthly basis. So that makes a lot of sense. And that didn't exist. And I was even wondering, why did it not exist? Because if you look at the car market, and a car tends to depreciate, like watches can also depreciate, but they tend to be more stable. Why does it not exist? So like bringing this financial logic to the asset class of watches. But then you get two nice aspects to it. As I said in the very beginning, rationality and emotionality. I mean, you have that, you purchase something which has a value, and then you also purchase something which has a history, which which makes you feel good, which allows you to open a conversation with others. That's fascinating.
Yeah, that's really, really great to know. I still have one more question, Stefan, and I think everyone, especially those beginners, for example, like me, will be really, really interested in knowing is like, are there any common pitfalls like in the watch investment industry? Let's talk about this overall. And for beginners like me, for example, are there any tips that you may want to, tell me?
Well, I probably would say that one of the tips is that if you are looking to purchase a watch, I
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't do it for the sole reason of investing and actually have capital appreciation. I buy something and I would be able to resell it at a higher price. I think this is something I would do because it gives me good comfort when I spend, and that's exactly what it is. When I spend 5,000, it's a lot of money, when I spend 10,000, it's even more money. It always also depends on how much a person is earning, but it tends to always be a lot of money for the person that purchases it. So you got to put that into relation. So common pitfalls is don't overestimate that you will be able to easily sell it, right? So if you need that liquidity back, that's a risk. Even though there are marketplaces and all that's a risk. But then and the other
Mm,
pitfall, I mean, it's not that easy. If you wanted to purchase, I get asked that often, right? So can I purchase a Rolex Daytona? And we spoke so much
mhm.
about Rolex, and we should have probably
Yeah.
mentioned some of the other brands as well, right? But
By the
but if
way,
you wanted
this
to
video is
purchase
not
a,
sponsored by Rolex.
unfortunately, it's not sponsored. If they see it, they probably they should come back to us. No, but it's so difficult to buy those watches because
Yeah.
there is such a high demand for it. And I think those watches, the ones that are so high in demand, they should really go to people that are genuinely passionate for the watches. So that
Mm,
a Rolex Daytona that is sold is not immediately resold by someone. So it should actually go to
mm,
someone who appreciates just the watch and fair over time. Let's say after a couple of years, when your taste develops, Daytona will always be a nice watch, but you probably think at some point, wow, I like independent watches. For that's very interesting from my perspective. The first time
mm,
I saw an Uhrwerk watch, and I felt like, what is this kind of a spaced up watch? And like,
mhm,
who would buy that? But then the more often you see it, and I was lucky enough also I could visit them, and then you suddenly think, like, this is really cool. Like such a small manufacturer, like everyone already has done, round watches, etc. So displaying the time mechanically in a different way than with this typical hands, dial hands, etc. And then I feel like, wow, this is actually really cool. And they are not the only one. There are other amazing brands, MB&F, and many others, FP Journe, but they're more in the classic end also. Um, and then you will probably sell your Daytona because you have taste for something which is more extravagant. Because let's
mm,
face it, a Daytona is a beautiful watch, but it's not rare. Like you will see many people wearing a Daytona. You will see even more people wearing
mm,
Omegas and other watches. So if you want to have something rare, then suddenly you look for vintage watches. You look for independent brands, and I think that's the beauty of it as well. Like have something that not everyone has.
Yeah, it's really, really great to know. If I really, for example, if I may summarize it into one word for the key takeaway of the last question is passion. You really need to have a passion for watch. It's not a pure, it's not okay. Now I have 20K in cash only. I want to put the 20K in watch. It's not something Stefan really advising us to do. And then the second thing is really we need to have a passion. I mean, we need to have a passion
Mm.
for it and we need to how to appreciate. So
But I
before I
must
let
say
you,
something. So
yeah.
2 years ago, I read an interesting consultancy report, actually in China or in Hong Kong, and that actually said it's also a form of knowledge and
Mhm.
social status. If you know about those products, it's the same. At some point, you are interested in art, and that's why we go to museums. So it kind of elevates you to a certain level to have a basic understanding of what are the watch brands and what are the complications and all those things. So I think it's just also in general interesting to educate yourself more about watches.
Yeah, great. Stefan, the watch expert. Are there any last words that you want to leave for our audience today
I mean,
before?
it was really a pleasure. I mean, I would invite anyone have a look at yourasset.com, the marketplace, because you can browse and explore many beautiful watches. Most of them are available for sale, but then we also have a large curated database just to educate about many of the brands and browse the beautiful photos. And I encourage people to enter that hobby. I mean, at some point, it's also a hobby. And I'm part of a watch group, for example, and it's just fun. We have an ongoing conversation. It's like, some people, they like bowling, some people, they like to do other sports, and people can connect over watches, and I think that's cool. It's a community aspect to it as well.
Yeah, it's a great community as well. We learn and we educate each other. That's great. I mean, today I learned a lot from you, Stefan, and I really hope our audience will, already learn a lot from you from this conversation as well. So thank you so much for
Pleasure.
joining us today. Yeah, so we'll
It
see
was an
you next
absolute
time. I'll
pleasure.
see you
Thank you,
soon in
Charlene.